part of the room looks very clean, and then you look over to the child side of the house. This is our first podcast in the home, which in some ways is really convenient, but on the other hand, I mean, you have a little one. It's like, we're gonna have a camera in our house. We have to clean.
Right.
Yeah.
Which can be a good thing.
Yeah.
I guess. Sometimes it's good to have a reason
to clean.
Yeah.
Yes. This morning I was thinking, Robyn is one of my friends that I don't really give a crap if my house is super
I'm
clean.
really glad to hear that.
I remember you saying to me, I'm not a very good homemaker.
Though I've been happy this week. Doug's been gone, my partner, and the house has actually been cleaner than it ever is.
What is that saying?
I hire a cleaner. Yeah, I was like, I guess it's all him, even though I know it's not. There's like one fewer person, and like I think I just am spending more time in the evening being like, okay, I need some alone time. I'll feel better about it if I'm cleaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually like cleaning. I mean, we don't have to go down this tangent, but monotonous work like that, and just like doing it and going slowly and appreciating that task. When I'm panic cleaning, that's not fun.
No, I agree. Or if I'm doing that and making dinner and trying to parent at the same time,
that's not fun.
Often I'm just like, Doug, you take Jasper and I will put on a podcast and clean.
Yes.
And that seems really nice. That's like a treat.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks for being here, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
It's been a long time coming. We've been talking about this, and it's been a long time since I've done a podcast episode, and I think you're number 10 actually.
Oh, wow.
Which is really exciting.
That's special.
So I guess I really wanted to have you on the podcast because I think right now it's really timely with everything that's going on in the world, and your passions and expertise and things that you're really keyed in about. I think people need to hear what you have to say. So
thank you.
You're welcome. And so I actually don't even know is it McLean? Robyn McLean?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So Robyn McLean. I met Robyn through some friends here in Kamloops, and I felt like instant friendship when we met. I was like, oh yeah, this lady, she's going to be part of my life because she's so sweet. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. Well, where to start? So I guess we started today by talking a lot about parenting and household stuff. So I'll say, first of all, I'm a mom of a 3 and an 11, 12-year-old. So he'll be 4 next month. And it's interesting because on things that I write about myself, sometimes I find I forget that to put in that mother role. And I feel like that comes from a place of just noticing how difficult it is to do the other things that I'm passionate about and parent, and that it's not always accepted, or it's not always, I don't know, the motherhood role and the parent role in general is just seen in such a strange way in society. So
like almost like a given, like you don't mention like, oh yeah, I'm a parent or I'm a mother. Like that's one role that we do leave it out so often, but it's the most consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been really neat during COVID to see how many people are just in their homes, showing their homes as they are. It seems like they're being more themselves, including just being like, oh, my kid might come in during this call, and having less and less like embarrassment about that. And I've been trying to point out, isn't it ridiculous that we've ever been embarrassed about that? Like, oh, sorry, my kid's here. Like,
or my kid's crying.
You didn't realize this, but I'm a superhero. It's like doing all this, amazing work in the world and balancing all these things, and also having to think about, how to raise this human. And some of that stuff is really like just using such a different part of our brain, if it's using our brain at all.
Yeah, that's a really good point around COVID that, I thought about this so much in the beginning, how it pulled us into our homes in a different way, even though it wasn't necessarily slower because many of us were now at home parenting and working. family all of a sudden became more of a center again.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say that that wasn't hard on us, with kids and working, but it just changed things. I don't know if it changed things for you, but I don't know. I started being way more active in certain areas of my home life that I hadn't been for quite a while, like baking,
Me too.
gardening, doing things that I had just kind of thought wasn't as important as like working and socializing and being out in the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you're a mom. I want to get
I'm a
back to
mom.
it. You're a
Yes,
mom. What else are you?
tangented.
No, I did too. You're a mom. What else are you, Robyn?
So how I've been thinking about myself a lot lately is just someone who's really interested in change and transformation and all of the ways that looks. So in my professional life, for about 15 years, I've been doing program evaluation, which is working with people in government, non-for-profit, sometimes private business as well, who are trying to make some kind of change in the world, usually change that looks like social good of some sort. And, sitting down with them and saying, what are your goals? How do we articulate those goals clearly? And then how do we assess where you're at in terms of meeting those goals? So collecting information through interviews, surveys, review, just observation, and helping them figure out what's working, what's not working, and how can we move in the direction we want to move. So the pretty much the minute I discovered that was a field, I was drawn to it. So I had been doing some research and finding I just liked the tasks, but didn't really like the research world. I find that it's typical to think a lot of research is done and sits on the shelf and is somewhat separate.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the ivory tower. It's somewhat separate from the rest of society. So it's it didn't feel like the best way to make a dent or to make a big shift or to help transformation happen in society. And that's what I've always really been drawn to, is saying there's things that aren't working so well in the world. So how do we be part of the team that helps make them better? And evaluation has been a really great field for that. And then in the last few years, I would say I'm more and more diving into, I would say diving in or zooming out to, yes, that's one tool, but what are the other tools at our disposal or at my disposal? And trying to say I can have a professional identity, but it doesn't need to only be about paid work. And actually, I don't just want a professional identity. I want to have an identity that encompasses all these different parts of me. And it's...
So Robyn, can I interrupt? Does that look like, so when you talk, this is such a cool place to go, but when you're talking about like a professional identity and then like that not just being like Robyn the evaluator, like Robyn the change maker, but it's like, how do you integrate that into your actual life in every way? So what does that look like for you?
Well, one way that I think of it, I recently joined a community online called, I think they called it BeTheChange.org, and it's a social experiment with someone named Terry Patton, who wrote a book called New Republic of the Heart. He's just bringing people together who are interested in being the change and I guess exploring what that means and what that looks like. So the way that I described myself in that community was to say there was all these things in my life that seemed kind of separate or disparate. And that's the fact that I love going to festivals and ecstatic dance, and I'm a musician, and I'm a mother. And then I also have this professional identity, and I'm really interested in change. And it seemed like being part of this community, I realized just how much all of those things need to and can come together. So another way I would describe that is I've been working on this big theory of how to transform the world, how to transform society. That's my big kind of passion project, where everything that I'm interested in is kind of gelling into one.
So you're
master theory.
Oh, that you're braining, that you're creating.
Yeah, I would say identifying more than creating, because it's more about like really deep observation of what's going on in the world and what others are saying, and trying to bring it together
Oh, like a
into
synthesis.
some kind of synthesis. Yeah, like a meta analysis or
Yes.
meta narrative of some sort. So through that, what's been really neat is to recognize that so many theories of systems change are very heady. They're very intellectual, and they're very kind of, they might be about recognizing what big shifts need to happen, but it seems to be along the same realm of what society already looks like.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's been the tradition. Whereas I feel like in the last few years, there's been more people recognizing what we're missing is actually those pieces of myself that I felt were disparate. So what is ecstatic dance bringing? What is the festival life bringing? It's bringing this sense of vibrancy and community, celebration, and wildness and love, and all these things that saying those words in professional places can feel really strange. Like I'm trying to do it more, and at some points it has felt like it doesn't fit. But I feel like more and more there's more and more of us saying, "Oh, that's what we're missing." And if we don't take that sort of that part of life into account when we're looking at how the world needs to shift, then we're missing probably some of the biggest elements.
Totally. And when you say that, Robyn, the first thing that comes to mind, or the first word that comes to mind, is embodiment, right? So what you said around a lot of these approaches have been very intellectual or cognitive, and also being an artist, and actually going through this process right now that you're speaking about, of like integrating my art identity and who I am as a musician and an artist, and then who I am as a counselor, a mental health counselor, and a podcaster. Instead of having all these separate identities, it's like, what is all of this, right? So this idea of art and culture and community through art and culture, like you're talking festivals, and through experience, like experiential pieces of life and embodiment, those have been so often pushed to the side. And we've looked at, okay, how do we change this through economic policy? How do we change this through social policy? We haven't looked at these other components of life that, if we were to really think about, have been center stones to our communities since we ever known, like since, the time that people have been documenting, or art, culture, celebration, food, dance. Yeah. Cool.
And I really like that connection of I guess I like the simplicity of saying a lot of that is about embodiment. So this clue that if we're only using our brains, that we're probably not living in a full way like we're meant to.
Yes.
So so like going back to this idea of my big theory of what needs to shift in the world and how we do it, that's a big part of it too. One of my major theories, sub-theories of the big theory, is that we need to love our lives as we're making this change. We can't be trying to make some change by working hard in the same way we've been always working hard, or putting our nose down and our bums up and just like studying books to be like, how is this change going to happen? We need to read and listen and watch and discuss and dance and live and experiment in ways that are really embodied. And I still obviously don't have like the answer of exactly how that will all unfold, or exactly where to start or what to do. But I feel, since I've been digging into it, a sense of, I guess, eagerness to keep digging, and a really deep down sense of peace that we know what we need.
Yes.
As people, and we've really lost touch with our inner voices and our intuition, and that's really the path back. And it feels there's so many awful things in the world. It feels there is an urgency to go out and do something to fix it. So we can't just sit in our houses and meditate. But, I guess that's kind of a paradox, and yet it's not. Like, we do have to start with finding our inner voices.
Yes.
And then I feel like we need to take what we learn regularly and live it.
Yes.
And feel what it feels like to be living from that place of our inner voice.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So hopefully I can learn to do it more. So, I can speak it really beautifully, and then I live my life. And sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. I would say it's there definitely more than it used to be. And I'm really grateful for clues and teachers and like examples I see in my life of people like you who are kind of living that question as well.
Trying to, yeah, always.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it's an everyday thing. It's like, it's never just, okay, I'm gonna live this way, or I'm going to live in an embodied way and connect with my intuition. Like, I know on the surface for some people that might be listening, that sounds like maybe a bit cheesy or a bit flaky, but I like to use the word instead of intuition because maybe that feels inaccessible to some people. This phrase of sense of knowing, right? So there's a sense of knowing that we have within us, and when we experience trauma, lots of times we can disconnect from that sense of knowing because we start to not trust ourselves because we've had challenging situations that maybe we couldn't predict, or we felt like somehow they were our fault. And so we disconnect from that sense of knowing. And when you think about what's happening on a global level, like in regards to like trauma or impacts, it's like, it's really easy right now to not connect to that sense of knowing that we have, because there's so many distractions as well, like through our phones and there's ways to dissociate from our lives. But I would say that the number one thing that we need to do is actually just be aware of what is in this moment. And that's not necessarily like sitting at home meditating, but if we can be honest about where we're at as a society, as a community, that's how we start to make the change, because we're being honest about what's not working. And that's actually a really difficult thing for a lot of us, whether that's in your own relationships or what's not working in your life through you. But if you can start there in that honesty and then dip into that, okay, but what is it that I really long for? Or what is it that I really want, both in myself, in my family, and in my community? Those are the questions to live every day. And then it takes a lot of courage to start to live that. So but that is the change, right? And what you had talked about is, another word that came to mind is attuning to pleasure, right? So when we think about, okay, we need to make a difference, like let's put our head down and be productive and research and like that feels overwhelming, and that feels like no fun. And if it sounds like burnout to me, as it does for many people. So how can we do that while attuning to pleasure and greatness in our life? Because through that pleasure and fully living, like you said, that's where we're going to feel inspired to continue to live in these ways and to make the change. But if we're pulling constantly from a place that there's no resource, because we're not filling up ourselves, our souls, or whatever, however you want to say it, we're not going to last in this transformation of community.
Mm-hmm. It's really beautifully said, and it's such an important lesson. And I feel like the way that we've been taught, that we've been shown and told we're meant to live is so different than that. And so my experience from hearing that message of you deserve pleasure and pleasure is protest, and then trying to live that way, it's so amazing to see how much guilt and confusion comes up when I do it. Like this past month, I turned 40, and I was so, even this word shows how I'm seeing it. I was so indulgent. Like I asked for what I wanted. I got what I wanted, and then more. And then I gave myself more. And I'm getting emotional just talking about it because I didn't allow myself that in the past. And it's just so sad that we're all doing that to ourselves and to each other. And it wasn't even huge things that I was doing. I was just, taking a little bit more time off of work and taking time to be in nature and taking time, a little bit of time away from being a parent, because my husband's away now and he knew that it would help me to have some time of my own. And taking time to think and meditate and write and read and all of those things. And the interesting thing is some of those things that I did costed money, but most of them didn't.
Yeah. Just time.
Yeah.
And intention.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is actually a book called Pleasure Activism.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
I've read pieces of it. That's kind of how I do this.
That's also
do my research. I realize I have about 6 books on my iBooks that I've been reading for a couple of years now, and I just flip them open. I take in some things, and I spend a lot of time integrating. And I as I've been doing this project of a big theory of change, I keep finding myself telling myself, you need to sit down and do more research. You need to make sense of those things. And then sometimes I do sit down and I have organized what I've kept track of all along. And I'm like, I learn through osmosis or diffusion. I learn slowly and I integrate slowly. And all of it has come together into something that I've made sense of. I'm not like fire hose. I'm not like taking all the information in by fire hose. And like some people are super good at that.
Mm-hmm.
My partner is amazing at just plowing through, learning a ton and coming out with lots of learning on the other side. And that's how he works. And I love working with him for that reason. But I recently had a conversation with somebody who said, she's in the community of practice that I mentioned. And she said, you did a presentation, you presented all these huge ideas or a piece of them, and then you retreated and you didn't feel the need to like invite people to more or say what was next or, so I have this impression of you, Robyn, that you can let things gestate. Mm. And I was like, wow, that's such a different way of looking at it than me who thinks I'm procrastinating or confused or like not really sure what to do next and feeling scattered about it. But really, I just haven't been in a huge rush. I want it to come. We kept kind of stretching the gestation and pregnancy and giving birth metaphor, and it's kind of saying, I want that baby to come out when it's ready and in the form that it's meant to. And so that is
that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think too, you're an extremely thoughtful person. Just from my experience of you. And so that doesn't surprise me that this is your approach to what you're synthesizing and what you're trying to offer to the community in regards to an idea of change and an idea of how we might go about transforming our community. One of the things, Robyn, you said that I wanted to talk about is, I can't quite remember what it was that you said, but we were talking about like living from here and not, or that we have the tools and we know how we need to do it all, right? And so one of the thoughts that came to mind, and I acknowledge that things aren't always linear, but this idea of evolution, right? And so when I think about where maybe our parents or our grandparents were at, they needed to be in the productivity survival mode. Well, maybe they didn't, but they were, right, for the way that the society was set up, and because they were there, because they did that, right. So I think about my grandmother. They didn't have a lot of money. They were quite poor. They had a lot of focus on survival, and even throughout my mom's childhood, it was always like gardening and doing all these things, and so it had to be very productive, and there wasn't enough time for these types of ponderings or conversations because they just needed to get food in their bodies and survive. And then I think about where we're at now, and now we actually have the space. So this idea that like maybe we've been in that cognitive productivity stage because that's where we needed to be. And before that, maybe it was more that we were, as human beings, more like celebratory or connected to the land. And so we've gone through this place of being more connected to the land and more community-based and celebratory. And then we've gone into this stage of human existence where we've been highly productive and the agricultural industrial revolution. And then now we're at this place where we have both this cognitive capacity, and then we're all being called back to this place of, okay, now we have to connect back to the land. And what do we need to do to feel connected and to heal the earth and to, or not heal the earth, but heal with the earth. So that maybe this is just a stage in evolution where now we've had those tools, we've kind of separated, we went into this more cognitive place, and now it's like, okay, the next step is integration. We have the technology, we have the knowledge, the ability to study, to research, and then now we're going to connect into those more ancestral places of like dance and embodiment and connection to the land and our ancestors, and in doing that, that's the next place.
And I feel like that's a really nice way to look at it. And some people seem to feel like either humans are a parasite and this is the way we're meant to be, is parasitic and not helpful for the earth and not in tune with it, with her. And, I think there's a few different theories floating around about it, or that maybe just that we've kind of gone off the rails and we need to actually fully go back to the way we used to be. And I'm more along the lines of what you're saying, where it's like there's things that we've learned now. I feel like we've kind of not just seen, but lived like how much separation there can be, and recognize that this isn't what we want and this isn't good for anybody involved, including the people who are, swimming in riches because of it.
And when I'm constantly thinking from this place of human development, but when we look at children or humans in general, we always have to brush up against boundaries, or there's natural consequences, right? That's how we learn. And so, Joni's going to jump on the couch until, and I'll say to her every time, don't jump on the couch. Sit down, sit down. Well, it wasn't until she jumped on the couch, fell off, and hurt herself. Well, now she's cautious to jump on the couch. So that might sound simplistic, but like if we were to apply that to a broader, societal perspective, it's like our pendulum has swung. We've focused a lot on money, productivity, resource extraction, external information, consuming external information. And we're hitting a boundary we have a virus that has now come up because of, all of our travel and all of our overly globalized world. And that's a sign. There's other limits that we're hitting, right? Like fuel limits and economic limits. So I think that this is actually quite natural for us to hit this limit and go, oh crap, that's not what I want. And we have to learn from it. And that's how we learn. That is how we learn. And it's how we've always learned. And other animals learn that way too. So I just like to see it as a natural process. And yeah, it's uncomfortable and, we've done some damage, but it's how we learn.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I think it's also important not to over idealize it and not assume that it's linear, because I think that I've also seen some people point back to societies that had similar obsessions with riches and external things, and people are talking about right now as the sixth extinction, which is a book that I haven't read, but
what is that?
It's the idea that there's been extinctions in the past of the human race, like the Mayans, and I can't remember the other cultures that they list, but where we can see in the world a lot of relics that are from those cultures and evidence that they sort of went too far and then were wiped out or wiped themselves out, and that we are on a similar trajectory. And again, to me, that's another theory that's like good to keep in mind, that,
Mhm.
if we don't fully understand what has been done and in the past and what mistakes were made, that we run the risk of just assuming we're different, and um, that things will just sort of flow as they're going to flow, and everything will be okay. And I don't feel like we're doomed, and I don't feel like we can just sort of sit back on our laurels either. I feel like the middle ground, if you can call it that, is more like what you were talking about, of recognizing we've hit a limit and we've also come really far in other ways. So how do we use what we've learned and bring all of those things on board to bring about the change we need to see?
And doesn't that just feel better? Like you say that, right? And just as you say that, there's a burden that's lifted off my shoulders when I think about transformation, because or change in our communities, because we talk about it. A lot of us talk about it, but it feels like it's too much. Like it's something that we can't actually do. But when you say it in that way, Robyn, about accessing the resources and the things that we have done really well, uh, there's something empowering about that. Like, okay, yeah, okay, we're not all bad. We're not all like screwed up, and we haven't messed it up so much that there's no going back,
Mm-hmm.
or there's no going forward, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. So in your theory of change that you're synthesizing, I'm interested in on what you would say around um, like what are some of the simple things, or maybe not simple things, but what are some of the things other than like attuning to pleasure, or dance and festivals, and like living your life? What are some other things that people can like work towards, or try?
So one of the first steps for me, I feel like I've implied this already, but I'll just say it in a
Yeah.
slightly different way, is like really tuning into our inner knowing. And to me, part of that is about healing and recognizing the traumas we've had and where we're dissociating, as you mentioned, and being able to engage fully in what is here and what's happening in the world and what's happening internally. And another piece of that, the kind of the outcome, without being too sort of utilitarian about it, to me is about finding each of our geniuses. And genius is a word that I've heard Michael Mead use. He has a podcast and he has a number of books about this, that it's not about, a handful of really smart people. It's about something that's inside each of us. That's like the gift that our soul is meant to give to the world. And it's a really beautiful concept. And it's one that, to me, is a way forward into transformation. And it's also the way our world will look and feel as we get into this new way of being and living. It's about recognizing that there's not just a handful of ways to be exceptional in the world, the way that sort of the society tells us there is. There's not just you can be rich, or you can be beautiful, or you can be really smart, and there's more than that. But there is a simplicity right now to what we accept as being, um, you know, having status or the best way to be. Whereas I think a more true way for society to function is we're all living our truths, or living the way our soul wants to sing out or express itself, and that those things will very naturally, all the different souls and geniuses will very naturally work together in a way that creates a harmony that the world needs. So the more work we can do to tune in and say, what is conditioning that tells me how I should be living my life and what I should or shouldn't be doing, and what is actually my soul saying, this is what you want to be doing. And there's a really simple quote I remember seeing on Facebook years ago that was like, don't ask what the world needs, ask what you want to do, because the world needs more people that are doing that. And I didn't get that quote exactly right, but
Along
it's
those lines.
it's that basic idea. So that's one. I feel like that's one simple step. And I feel like the difference between, I used to kind of get confused by this paradox of, should I be out there working in the world or should I be meditating in a cave? And like really in my university days was studying, like I studied philosophy and psychology and political science. And it was like, there was like a couple of really different theories of what's the best life to live. And this idea of self-healing or self-work or enlightenment, I think is the word I'm looking for, always seemed to come down to divorcing yourself from society.
Renunciation.
And I always rejected it. And what I've really come to is embodiment, just as we've talked about, that there is a whole lot more enlightenment, tuning in, meditation, inner work that I can do as an individual. Like I'm one that tends toward kind of being in the outer world and not tending to my inner needs as much as I could. And I think there's a lot of us like that. And I think there's maybe some people who tend the other way. And I think we all need to kind of try to find that middle place where we're doing our inner work and then we're going out and living it, just as we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And, as you're speaking, Robyn, it's for those that are listening, sometimes that can feel inaccessible, like doing our own work, or overwhelming, or that it's not as important as, say, doing that outer work, like going to work or tending to our family. But when you really think about it, the way that we engage with other people in our environment and in our communities is highly impacted by the way that we engage with ourselves. And for so long, we've disconnected these two. Like you could be a certain type of community member, and then, you could treat yourself when no one's around really poorly. But the reality is that the way that we treat Mother Earth, the way that we treat people that don't have housing, the way that we treat people of different cultures and different races and skin colors and sexual orientation, that is a reflection of your openness and your ability to accept that which is different and to accept the discomfort in our lives too, right? So our inability to also be present shows up in how our economic systems are set up and how our social systems are set up. So they're not separate at all. And you have to start first with yourself. And I know me personally as well, I've so often just like pushed aside this idea of like living your passion, or, I say it in this voice because for so long I'm like, oh, it's such a crock of shit, right? Like you just gotta make a good life and like have good friends. But when I work with people in counseling, and I've been through this journey myself, it's when we're depressed or we're anxious or we're not well. And there's so many different variations of what not well might look like in regards to like mental health disorders or whatever. So often it's because we're not connected to ourselves. We're not connected to what we really want to do, or we're not living the things that are important to us. And they don't have to be your job either. So when we say living the things that are important to us, so I'll give you some examples. Recently, I've been doing a lot more with my creative self. And I've ebbed and flowed with my music in my life. I went through periods of time where I actually didn't do any music. And I was fully in activism mode. I was president of the Students' Union. I was like planning rallies and doing all sorts of activism. And I was really angry, to be honest. Like I was a very angry activist, had a megaphone, felt really like, really angry and like, I'm going to make change. And then I was not doing any creative practice. And what happened is I ended up having this like anxiety, panic attack, like ongoing anxiety. And then I started going to counseling and realized that, my counselor asked, like, what do you do creatively? Well, I'm like, it's been 6 years since I've picked up a guitar and sang. And so I sang for my counselor one day, and she was like, no, like you have to do this. And I'm like, yeah, well, music doesn't make a lot of money. And she's like, no, you don't have to do it for work. You just got to do it. And so now when I'm working with people, one of the first questions I ask them is, what do you do creatively? And people, oh, I'm not an artist or whatever. And then as we dig a bit deeper, someone will say, well, when I was a kid, I used to play piano, and when I would play piano, it would be really timeless. It's like it always made me feel good. Or someone will say, I used to do cross stitching a lot, or I used to. I mean, it goes on, and you're like, well, when's the last time you did that? And when I encourage people to get back to some sort of pleasureful creative practice, sewing, doodling, whatever it is, they'll come back within a couple of weeks, and there'll just be a sense of ease within themselves. And that's not even looking at, like, say, the anxiety or the depression or the trauma. That's just helping them connect to themselves through this creative practice that's free flowing and open, right? So I just wanted to speak to that, because when we talk about living what we need to live, that doesn't necessarily mean occupation either, right?
Absolutely. And so hearing you talk and what we've talked about so far makes me want to go back to the question of, like, what can we all do as people, and, like, what are the next steps for transformation? And one of probably the most important things for us all to do is to get into a space of being able to collaborate with each other in a way that we're not necessarily used to right now. So the term I'm always using lately is transformational collaboration. So being in a space where we can learn with each other and learn from each other and bring our true selves together to say, what do we have to offer, in such a way that the whole is different, greater than the sum of its parts. And there's so many opportunities for transformation that come out of collaboration from people who are actively in their genius or in their healing spaces. Not that we need to be healed or already in our genius. It's just people who are living in those questions, the way we talked about. And I've come to notice how different I approach my work, which is in the outer world, and it's not activism in terms of rallies and protests and fighting against the system, but it's trying to kind of either change the system from within or create kind of new systems that will slowly make the other ones irrelevant. And I recognize that the most important thing is for me to do that work in a calm, loving, spacious way, so that every interaction I have, I hope that people come out feeling inspired and calm and recognizing that they're okay, and that they're more than okay, and that there's a light inside themselves that they want to see burn brighter, and that those things can come out in even the smallest of interactions. And I remember coming to that conclusion really early in my sort of adult life, as I was kind of searching for what my place was. And I was like, oh, I have to find the thing in the outer world that's the most effective. And I remember feeling a calmness, just being like, you know what, you'll find it. But in the meantime, just be good in everyone that you interact with, and that will create a good ripple. And I don't necessarily think that's going to be enough if that's all we're doing. I think we also have to pay attention to the bigger systems and the bigger picture, and really understand it in a kind of global way where we're going and how we need to get there. But we can't only do the inner work, and we can't only do that global work. So to me, it's about the phrase that I've heard said more often lately is whole systems change. And that's usually referring to, like, we need to look at the economic, education, criminal, like all of those systems all at the same time. And that's true. But I think the other systems we need to look at is the system within ourselves and the systems within our families, our communities, our friendships. And one phrase I really like that I feel like captures this in a really simple way is move at the speed of trust. So when you're out there doing work in your community or in, well, really any type of work that's with people, and most of our work is, don't try to force some agenda or some change, or even if it's something that we all feel or know needs to happen, by leaving people behind.
Yeah.
Because we need to embody what we want to see in the world as we're doing those changes. And I think that's the piece that's been missing a bit in sort of classic activism.
Yes.
And that I'm hearing, I have never really been in those circles, but I'm kind of listening in through different podcasts and things like that. I'm hearing that there's a movement that's trying to heal the resistance movement, and I think there's so much there for everyone to learn from.
Yeah, and I just said need to do because I'm like, yeah, we need to heal that. Just having been, obviously not necessarily in some of the movements that are happening right now, but having been in other social movements in my younger days, is that there's this justification that kind of sits within these movements that like violence will somehow beget peace, right? That through being violent in our resistance, that's how we're going to get deep change. And I know that this is a very controversial thing to say, and I acknowledge that, because sometimes it feels like we have to be violent to be heard from systems. So like when I'm talking about violence, I'm talking about like destroying things and stealing things and hurting others because we feel like the cause is bigger. And I just, even though that might get us some change in small increments, I don't think that is the way, because violence does not bring, being violent in the name of peace is not integral. And I'm not saying that we have to sit back and like meditate, but there's ways, if we look at certain cultures and certain movements, there's ways that people have been active and providing resistance that is peaceful, that is celebratory, that is art-based, that is, and I think about, actually, the first thing that comes to mind is First Nations people and Indigenous people, where resistance has always been through song, through prayer, through, peaceful roadblocks. What are your thoughts on that? I know it's a complicated issue right now. There's a lot of resistance going on in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've thought really similar things, and I've also tried to think or feel those things in a way that's not judgmental of anybody who is in the fed uprising, as I've heard it called, because that's completely reasonable and rational to just be so angry
and fed up.
And I've been in that place, like within personal relationships, or and on a macro level, recognizing what's wrong with the world. I've been in that place, and I think there is a place for anger, and I've started calling it sacred anger, to recognize like this is a way for me to, and us, to exert boundaries and say this is not okay. And I think it makes a lot of sense that the way that anger will come out can be spiky and violent and it's not, I don't know, I'm of two minds. On one hand, I'm like, it's not for me to say what is or isn't okay for people who have been so marginalized and so who, I can't even wrap my head around how difficult the conditions of their life have been, and how hard it is to get out of those conditions because of all this systemic bias. And I think but I also think that I also completely agree that at the end of the day, there has been amazing examples of resistance. I listened to a podcast with people that were really deeply trained and practiced in Kingsian nonviolence. So from Martin Luther King, from that thread, and studying for decades now what that means to resist and be firm in that resistance, but also not go to a place of letting that anger overtake or that or it being violent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Thanks
know.
for saying that, Robyn. I think I also want to acknowledge that I too agree that I don't know what it feels like to be in that place of oppression and like being trapped by systems. So I acknowledge that people, are just doing the best that they can. That is a belief that I really hold dear to my heart, is that, we're always doing the best that we can. And not from a place of judgment. I guess what I'm actually speaking from is a place of fear when I talk about that, like a place where I get scared that it's just going to become really violent, right? Because when resistance is violence and response is violence, then I get fearful of war. And so I'm not speaking from a place of judgment. I'm speaking from a place of fear
Yeah.
around like what's happening in the world. And but I do have faith and hope and trust in the fact that, we have the capacity to evolve and change, and that from this will come, because it will be transformed. That anger that is showing up maybe through more violence will be transformed in some way. And then I also want to acknowledge that sometimes the way that we see what's going on is curated by the media that we have. So I don't really know what's going on in the front lines because I'm not there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
And obviously I'm talking about I'm personally talking about like the Black Lives Matter movement, and, we called it the Fed Up movement. But this is really big stuff that's happening right now that we can't dissociate from. And yeah.
It's interesting. So I've started recording a podcast and I'm slowly sharing episodes from people who ask. And one of the reasons I haven't really dove in, recorded more, and advertised is because I knew a lot of people doing podcasts or other sort of public figures during the month of June that just didn't release anything because they wanted to uphold BIPOC voices, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I also just felt a sense of paralysis of like, I don't know how to be in this conflict. I'm scared of so many things, like the way that you talk about it. I'm scared of things getting to that place where I feel like my security threatened, and where there's a constant, and I mean, this is the case right now, where there's a constant sense that so many people's securities and livelihoods and safety and everything is threatened. And I was also just scared for my own sort of what if, there's not really a right way to be white right now.
Yeah.
Because it's, and I'm not saying that from like a complaining point of view.
I know.
Just more of a, we need to feel how deeply uncomfortable it is. And I just have a sense that I'm definitely not doing enough to fight against it. And I don't want to be performative either.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it's like that there's all these things of like, how do we move forward?
Yeah.
And what does it really look like? There was a huge thing that happened in my world. I think it was last week, where there's this podcast that I've been following as this sort of beacon of light. It was called Healing Justice and changed its name to Irresistible. And the host was a white woman who had been in movements for a long time, and she regularly interviewed people of color, and the whole project seemed to be a beacon of light. This is how we all move forward, and this is what allyship looks like. And then a week ago, I found all these articles calling her out as being terrible. And I mean, not terrible. I don't know. That's kind of, I'll just say more like she basically was working in a way that was not being an ally. was she brought on a couple of employees and basically just wasn't supporting them in the way that we all need to be supported as people and people working. And the way that it all kind of got called out was that there's some elements of white supremacist culture, like urgency, and there's a few others. And I saw these embedded into articles kind of talking about what this kind of work environment looked like.
So what is urgency? Is that like the productivity?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, the productivity mindset. So I mean, the way that I sort of understand the situation, it's not one that you could look at her and be like, she was totally taking advantage of people of color and like making herself look good. I don't think that was her intention. But the way that everything played out, it came out that one of the people of color wasn't making as much as someone else. And then it came out that she was asking for work on weekends and not supporting a restful, spacious work culture, and was putting pressure and not listening, not creating spaces for feedback when she obviously needed it. And there was a couple of other things that were even like more. And it was just like, I wrote to a couple of friends, was like, I'm having a crisis of meaning. Like, is it even possible for me as a white woman to do work around social and economic justice? And we're getting into working in the work that I do in Kamloops in the region and working with Indigenous communities as well. Is it possible for me to do that work in a way that has integrity and that is truly supportive? And I just had this moment of being like, is it possible? Should I even be doing it? Yeah. And I work with some amazing people, and I think the answer is yes, and be super careful and super reflective and super slow and super thoughtful
and integrated. So as you were telling that story, I'm like, what I'm hearing too is that this podcast and this woman had that's that community work, right? So she's out in the community working in this one way, yet the integration of that way isn't happening in her business or in her personal life. So it just brings me back to what we've said. It's like you have to live it in all the ways, right? You have to be self-reflective. I shouldn't say have to. Sorry. I think that one of the ways that we can move forward is through integration of this reflective, mindful, intentional life in all aspects. Like we can't just be performative or be one way outwardly and be different to ourselves or in our homes or in our businesses. And so, yeah, that's really what's happening here, and where people are getting called out and not being integrative or not being integral, or however we want to say it, congruent maybe is the best word. And it's scary in the sense that like it can be demobilizing. Is that a word? Immobilizing. It could be immobilizing because you're like, should I even try? Because like there's a possibility that I'm gonna screw it up and I'm gonna get called out, or so that is a culture that's showing up right now, this call out culture, this but again, like I guess the thing that is hard for me is the judgment in that, the judgmental piece of it, where we're being so hard on people as well at the same time. Like if we're going to bring light to certain issues, it would be really helpful if we were compassionate as well, and understanding that the humanness is experienced by all of us. And that the people that we're calling out or being critical of in the way that they're behaving, they also deserve compassion. Because when you think about when we judge people or when we're critical towards people, we don't actually support healing. We just support self-hate, more self-criticism, which is again immobilizing for people. So it's like when we're being really critical in general, or when we're questioning things is probably a better way. I'm hopeful that we can start to be more like gentler in that. And I'm not saying not firm. like, hey, that's not okay. But we just need to be cautious to not, again, just create more hate.
Yeah, I've come to that same conclusion, and you might tell I listen to a lot of podcasts by my references.
Yes.
Brene Brown's podcast is really wonderful, and she did a solo episode in the last few weeks, so maybe at the end of June, that was about shame, guilt, and accountability. And her basic, the basic thing she was really putting forward is there's no place for shame in movement.
Yes.
That if we truly want change, we can't make people think that that is a way they are and that they can't change.
Oh, it's beautiful, Brene Brown.
And she's just so, I keep saying she's, a little bit annoying, but really awesome.
Yeah, no, totally. I've had a hard time with her.
I say annoying just because, I don't know, there's some things that she overdoes, and but she's just so herself, and she's so authentic, and she's so funny, and her truths are so well researched.
Yes.
And then clarified so clearly, which is a rare thing to find in people that dive really deep and then can just boil it down to something that we can actually access and learn.
That's amazing.
The idea that we can't shame people. I know you avoided the word can't, but it's like, if we truly want change, it's counterproductive.
Yeah, we can't
to shame people.
Can't.
What does accountability look like? And I've gone through this with my partner actually recently, where there were things that I've been so unhappy with in the years that we've been together. And it's nothing huge, it's nothing big. I'm still with him. I love him. And yet there's been things that he hasn't been able to hear from me because of a deep sense of shame, I think, in himself. So I've had to be very firm but kind in how I bring it to him. And I've learned it is possible. And hard.
Yeah.
Because I haven't, I as the way that I am as a, compassionate person, I think I've backed off of it a number of times because I could tell it hurt him. And finally I was like, yeah, but who's hurting? It's me at the end of the day. So how do I just say, I still love you. You're a wonderful person. And this other thing is going on. And if you don't look at it, we can't change it.
Yeah.
And there's things I need to change and things both of us have changed. But at the end of the day, here's something we need to look at. And it's actually not the end of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can.
It rarely is.
And we can support each other through that, or like, I'll love you through that change as well. Yeah. And when we shame, when we shame our children, when we shame our partners, when we shame people for their beliefs or for their actions, that's when we create this dichotomy. We create this polarization, because when we shame, if you just take it back to, like, if you were to shame your child or your partner because they did something, the response is always defensiveness. It doesn't matter how much personal work you've done, right? You're going to respond with defensiveness most of the time. And when people go into defensiveness, they're not open to hearing anything. They actually go into a place where they hold more on to what they've done and their beliefs. And so when we look at what's happening right now in the world, like around politically, there's a lot of dichotomy happening where you're in one camp and you're in the other camp because of this shame and defensiveness. And then we just have more polarization, way less conversation, where, people aren't even speaking because they're scared that they're going to mess up. And if they mess up, then they'll be shamed publicly by the person they're speaking with by not being politically correct or saying something wrong. And then we don't have the conversation. And then that is actually the absolute worst thing that could happen right now, is for conversation to be shut down. And it's happening because people are ashamed or scared to make a mistake because the culture is so unforgiving. And it's one of the reasons why I haven't done podcasts for a while. Also because I've been doing what you're doing, where I've just been like, okay, what do I do? Like, I don't want to be performative. I don't want to speak on behalf of people. I don't want to go into a place of victimhood or shame for being white. And then also, like, how are we going to tackle this conversation on the podcast, right? Because it's so obvious. Like I'm not willing to do podcasts where we don't have these conversations. But how the fuck are we gonna? How are we going to navigate this area that is so full of shame and guilt? And but we're doing it well.
Yeah,
I was
just gonna say and I think I want to pat us on the back, and yet that's like feels uncomfortable. But really, what I think we all need to do, what I think we've tried to do today, is just feel our feelings around it, and speak what we're seeing, and be vulnerable, and maybe take a risk if there is a risk,
and maybe mess up, and maybe do something that you're going to look back at and think like, oh, I don't actually believe that, or I shouldn't say that. Okay, well, that's where the learning comes from again, right? Like we have to do things sometimes that we don't mean to do.
And I mean, this makes me I think I always, as I live my life, bring things back to the theory of how we move forward. So to have like a clear path forward with it, to me, it's about becoming really clear on the difference between guilt, shame, accountability, boundaries versus call out. Like that is a very different thing, and practicing that. And I brought up the example of my relationship to say that was a really big learning for me and for us. And I think I was able to continue to do that work because I could just see how that learning will serve me in all of the relationships I'm in. And that is, I've often marveled how interesting it is to be in it's a male-female relationship, and then we're a couple of years out from it now, but the Me Too culture and that call-out culture, and that, I mean, it's still happening, obviously, the dynamics and gender-wise, there's so much to learn in our personal relationships among men and women. And, in our community, I feel like I've done a lot of deep conversation with men and women about what it means to relate to each other. What can we learn from working through those things and being authentic and trying not noticing defensiveness rather than letting it take over.
Yes.
And identifying, being able to hear people as well as to speak. And that's hard.
That is hard. That's a practice.
Yeah, because as a woman, sometimes I'm just like, yeah, but, I obviously you've done more wrong than me or whatever. Like I have found myself doing that, or I found myself going into victimhood. And really tried to own that. And it's been a journey. Like it's been a huge journey. And I'm still on it, and probably will be my whole life.
Yeah. There's no end game here.
But living that question, to me, this is this idea of how we relate to each other. One part of it is transformational collaboration that I mentioned earlier, but we're not going to get there without doing deep collective healing as well, which is, we do our individual healing and we bring it out into the world, and then we repair relationships in a really deep way. And that, to me, is one of the pieces that feels scariest, most vulnerable, especially when I try to think about what does that look like in my personal life, but especially what does that look like in a work setting, to start to speak about the deepest shames and guilts and inequities that exist. And, when we're working in community, that's going to happen. So the challenge that I've given to myself, kind of recognizing in an intellectual way that is one of the ways forward for us to transform the world we live in, is to, gently push myself to bring those conversations, to learn how to facilitate them, to learn how to be part of them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to learn, but there's also a lot to learn from. There's, I always think about restorative justice as one of the examples that has kind of existed through all the mud of society. And it's been sort of a bright light that I've looked to again through my adult life. It's like, I just wanted to be in those rooms and learn more about that and see it in action. And my master's thesis, I studied a drug treatment court, which was called the Edmonton Drug Treatment and Community Restoration Court. So it was really about people who had drug addictions who harmed the community they were in by stealing and lying and manipulating, stealing from their families at times. They had a community of people who were in the same kind of addictive behavior that they were, but they just weren't living in a place often where there was trust and love. And I think a lot of them felt a deep shame of like, how do I get back to
how do I get out of this
authentic connection? And the program combined social work and social support with a court-based approach of like having lawyers meeting with a judge every week. And basically, if they didn't graduate, if they didn't like try in the program, if they didn't do what they needed to do, then they went to jail. So there was this like very firm boundary set of like, you can't use drugs while you're in this program, and you can't lie and still manipulate. There's a little bit of room of, we know that you're trying, or like that it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to change overnight, but we have to see that you're genuinely trying, and to see how this group of people, lawyers, social workers, me as whatever researcher, we would sit in a room before court every week and just talk in depth about where all of the participants were at and how best to help them. And I just saw transformation is possible, and people can apologize, make reparations, and generally the people I saw that took that program on and started to build those trusting relationships slowly but surely as they participated, came out just with such a desire to give back. Like that was like the phrase, give back. I want to be the best person I can be, and I want to continue to make reparations for the damage that I've done while I was in my addiction. And I want to take responsibility for that, and also know that I was struggling. And to me, it wasn't restorative justice exactly, but it had a lot of those elements.
Okay, I think we're getting to our time here.
There's a little one outside.
There is, but I just want to sum that up. So Robyn, or maybe not that, but one of the things, or not one of, there's many things we talked about today, but I think the main kind of theme that I'm seeing, or that maybe people can take away from this, is that really the first place is to start with you, like with yourself. And we're all in different places with that. But if you can start to live these questions and start to look at yourself and how you're behaving and how you want to live differently and embody the life that is actually going to feel pleasurable and whole and meaningful for you and your family, and working towards collaboration with, even just starting with your friends and your family, like this is where you start, is here. And then you can start to do the community-based stuff. But just remember that this place, starting here and healing yourself, is very fruitful, very impactful, and very, very important. Robyn, you mentioned your podcast, but can you tell us the name of your podcast?
It's called Weaving the Future. So it's on Spotify now, and hopefully will be on Apple soon.
Okay.
I'm having some trouble with it, but
okay. And so I'll link that in the show notes. And then, are you on Instagram? No, you're not.
I personally am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you on Instagram?
If
people want to follow you.
Robyn and Kamloops.
Robyn and Kamloops. Yeah. Okay. We'll link that. And then Weaving the Future is probably the best place for people to stay connected with you, hey?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say so. Yeah.
I feel like we might have to have a part 2 of this conversation.
I would love that.
I really do think that, because it's so thoughtful. So thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and for your amazing work and thoughts and being.
It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to share in community with you. It's inspiring.
Agreed.
So if Robyn has inspired you today to start living some of these questions, please go check out her podcast, Weaving the Future. It's a beautiful podcast, and Robyn has a lot to offer. So maybe we'll have her back. I feel like we will. Thanks, Robyn.
Sandra. Thank you.